You're listening to the official podcast of the Libertarian Party of Georgia. Learn about local issues, meet candidates, and find out what we're doing to bring more options to Georgia voters. Now here's your host, Brent Hilburn.
Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the next episode of the Georgia LibertyCast. This is our next in line of our Meet the Libertarian candidates for office this year. This is our Secretary of State podcast. Our Secretary of State candidate is Smythe DuVal. Smythe DuVal. And as always, our producer for this episode is Matt Franklin of Most Uniquest. Smythe, how are you?
Doing well. Well. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. First, tell us a little bit. Well, I'll tell you what, before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the Secretary of State's office. You know, I have this, as part of the podcast, I always research a little bit to give people an idea of, you know, what the actual, what the topic is. And I'll just say this about the Secretary of State's office. It's a constitutional statewide office in Georgia. Originally, it was an appointed office. Georgia's constitution has been rewritten a couple of times, and now it's an elected office. So what I'd like for you to do is touch on the different aspects that the office covers. And let me give you a couple of lists here. Some of the things were very interesting that I didn't know about. The Secretary of State's office is responsible for the archives and the history, all the business corporations. Of course, we all know about elections, professional licensing boards, securities and business regulation, and they're responsible for the Capitol tour and the information desk and the Capitol Museum. So the Secretary of State's office has quite a few things that they do. So tell us a little bit about Smythe.
All right. Well, I decided to run for Secretary of State this year. I'm running as an election reform platform. I'm a citizen candidate. I'm not a professional politician by any stretch of the imagination. I wanted to make a difference in election reform. I've been doing election reform probably for about 2 decades now, really specializing in ballot access. That was my forte. But here in this past year, I'm working on other political campaigns, libertarian political campaigns. I helped Christine Austin with State House 50. That kind of got me back into active politics. And she and I worked on a Gary Johnson website together. And from that experience, we decided that the Secretary of State would be an excellent race to bring election reform issues to the forefront. Types of issues that not only benefit libertarians, but benefit all minor parties, benefit all Georgians, all independents, anybody that would be interested in fair and elective elections, or fair and competitive elections. I am, in my 50s now. I've been a registered nurse. I did that for 9 years. Part of the reasons for doing that was I wanted to be able to spend time raising my children, and I wanted a career in which I did not have to be gone. I could actually set my own schedule. They're older now. I've since left clinical nursing and went into IT. And my last job was information technology director, so I'm kind of what I call a recovering IT director now. And, I did that in grad school over at Kennesaw State University and getting a graduate degree in information technology, and certainly have paid a lot of attention to cyber and cybersecurity, which is something that's becoming more and more important in elections and election systems these days. And it's a passion. This is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, and this was the year to do it. All the stars lined up. Here I am. I am the Libertarian Party nominee for Georgia Secretary of State, and we're taking this campaign to the people of the state of Georgia.
Excellent, excellent. Now, I ask everybody the same question first, because I think it's important, and that's the why Libertarian. And when I say why Libertarian, I mean it from the standpoint of, look, let's be honest, the state's set up for Republicans and Democrats. It's so much easier to say, I'm a Republican, and pay your money, and run under the Republican banner, and the same for Democrats. So why Libertarian? Because this is the hardest road, but why Libertarian?
I could not stomach Republican or Democrat. I haven't been a part of the major parties since Ross Perot ran in 1996. When they excluded him from the debates in 96, I knew it was rigged then. But I was independent for many, many years. I'm a fiscal conservative, social live and let live, and definitely anti-war. And when I started running with that campaign in State House 50, I learned of the Libertarians. That was in 2014, and it's like, wow, this is a platform. This is a something that I could get into, because you don't meet too many people. It used to be called moderates a long time ago. Somebody who was fiscally conservative, socially liberal. That was what kind of a moderate. But they don't have that anymore. And libertarianism makes more sense. I approached libertarians about, hey, I have been in election reform politics for a long time. I would like to bring this, and the libertarians here of Georgia, we talked about it, and so I'm here, and I'm looking forward to representing the libertarians in this race.
Excellent. So let's start going through the specific functions of the Secretary of State's office, where you see that a libertarian hand will help. Obviously, we know about elections. We're going to leave elections till last, because that's the most encompassing of what your campaign will cover. But let's talk about the corporations division of the Secretary of State.
Okay, so you have corporations division. You also have the business license. Anybody that wants to set up corporation in the state of Georgia, or for that matter, procure a business license, you're going to interact with the Secretary of State's office. And one of the things that you begin to learn about the Secretary of State office is that it's not necessarily a political position. In fact, it was kind of a sleepy position for the longest time, up until the 2000 presidential election. And if you remember the hanging chads and Katherine Harris, that's when the things started to change, and the Secretary of State became more of a political position. Until then, it's a very administrative, and corporate and business licensure is one of the many services that they provide to the public. There are ways that we could improve the service that the Georgia Secretary of State office provides, and that really has to do with funding and just the number of hands on deck that they have. That office was severely cut back after the Great Recession in 2009, 2010. They have never really been able to add the personnel that they need at the same time that corporate and business licenses are expanding, businesses expanding in the state of Georgia. One of the things as a Secretary of State I would want to do is approach the legislature and say, hey, look, you guys are always talking about making Georgia the place to do business.
Business
and yet,
friendly. We hear that all the time.
Right. And yet you're on the very first office that people have to come in contact with. They're having a harder time than they used to have turning that business license around. And I have talked to people on the campaign trail that said, it used to be I could get a business license in so many days. Now I actually end up having to pay the expedite fee to get it. And what we're beginning to suspect is that the Secretary of State's office is so underfunded that they're depending on the expedite fee for operational expenses. I don't know exactly if that's the case, but there is some suspect that they are depending on that expedite fee. That needs to change. We need to provide.
That's a direct cost to businesses in Georgia.
Well, yeah, and then if it's also just kind of a underhanded. If you think about it, if you want to get your business license in a timely manner, you're going to pay the expedite fee. It shouldn't be that way.
Right.
And certainly if everybody's doing it, then nobody's getting expedited. So,
right. They're providing the service that they should provide at the regular rate.
Yeah.
So you brought up professional licensing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for libertarians, this is probably one of the things that we squeal about the loudest, about how state governments specifically use professional licensing not only to limit choice in the marketplace, but also just flat out to generate revenue for the state. So libertarians are all over the board on this in terms of the way they want to deal with state licensing. Some are, let's eliminate licensing requirements altogether. The first thing you hear then is Bob the plumber is now going to be your doctor next week. From people who outside that, outside of government. But I think most libertarians, at least the ones that I know, want to see professional licensing reduced and actually reformed. So talk about professional licensing.
This is definitely an issue that we need to address in the state of Georgia. So over the years, the amount of and quantity of professional license, and I think it's up to 42 now, that the amount and quantity of licenses has increased. The hours that are required for specific things have increased, but there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to why one particular license is getting so many hours and so many requirements, whereas another license does not. For example, cosmetology, it takes thousands, 1,000 hours, very expensive training for a person to come into the state of Georgia and get the cosmetology training so that they can actually get the cosmetology license in the state of Georgia. And you contrast that with an EMT, or emergency medical technician that works in the back of an ambulance, and it only takes very few hours, sometimes less than 30, or right at 30. There's not any rhyme or reason for that. The other thing about the professional licensure that seems to be taking place is that it's a result of lobbyists in education industry being able to influence the legislature to say, hey, we need to create these licensures so that we have more health and more safety for these professions. But it just turns out that it's just creating revenue for these private education groups. As Secretary of State, we need to actually say, no, enough is enough. This is not only hurting the economy, it's not only hurting military families and spouses that transfer here from other states. And that's a big, big deal. If you have somebody transferring in from Fort Hood, Texas, and they've been doing cosmetology, doing hair and nails in Texas, and they've been doing it for years, but they arrive in Georgia, and they're no longer allowed to do it until they spend thousands and thousands of dollars of tuition so they can pass this. That's nuts. That is not the way to actually run a business-friendly state. We need to go through and say, okay, is it for the health and safety of the public? I'm a registered nurse. Okay, I have my first experience with the Secretary of State was taking my nursing licensure, otherwise known as the RN. Okay, and as a registered nurse, it was for the health and safety of the people that I would treat. Right. The reason cosmetology and other places and things do have licensure is usually for hygiene, but you don't need 1,000 hours to learn aseptic technique. You just need to know just enough. And that's what we need. We need to bring some common sense back into this. Librarians, I don't think there's any reason there's going to be nobody that's to put a health and safety problem if the librarian does not get a license. And that's just nuts. We need to go through these and
we can't have those dangerous librarians running around unlicensed. I mean, come on.
Yes.
That's crazy talk.
It is, but there are other states that have taken this on, and we need to follow suit and say, okay, let's put the restraints back on this and if it's health and safety matters, then yes, we go ahead and follow up with the licensing that's required, minimum licensing. Okay, you don't need to go nuts with it. You don't need to make it hard. All right, it just is the health and the safety of protected. Obviously, when you're talking about things like a librarian, that's not the case.
Interesting you brought up the fact that someone coming from another state.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you a scenario. So you have a lawyer who practices law in Tennessee, and that lawyer comes to Georgia and has to take the Georgia bar, obviously, to be licensed in Georgia because there are Georgia-specific laws and that type thing. But you use the Fort Hood example of where a cosmetologist comes from Texas to Georgia, and they still have to go through all that licensing process, even though I'll go out on a ledge here and say that hair and nails is probably very common in Fort Hood, like it is here in Georgia. So having said that, is this more, I mean, is the state just using it as revenue generation?
It appears that way. When you don't have any rhyme or reason as to why you have so many requirements for one profession and you have so few requirements for another profession, that there is a lobbyist in the middle of that somewhere, and there's money. Follow the money, and as they say, there's money being generated either for the state or for these institutions that are providing the training so that you can actually pass the licensure. But yes, there is. I think the most onerous example is the emergency medical technicians have so few requirements, and the cosmetologists have so many, and that's just wrong.
Right. So someone who administers potentially life-saving care has a fraction of the requirements that someone who does your nails.
Correct. That is, yeah, and the only way that I can come up with an explanation for that is there is a lobbyist. There's something going on wherever the money's going. So
from a reform standpoint, reforming professional licensing would look like what from a libertarian standpoint?
So there is I can't remember the acronym at the moment, but there is a committee already set up that's supposed to review Georgia licensing requirements, compare that to with what the licensing requirements are being done in other states, and keep it up to date. Obviously, this board or this commission is not doing what they're charged to do. So one of the very first things is to take a look and investigate, okay, why is this board not doing it? Is it because they're not funded? Is it because they don't have the authority? Is it because nobody's ever called a meeting? I mean, who knows? But it is really taking the time to get underneath that. But it's also getting in front of the legislature and saying, okay, we have some challenges. We need to clean this up. And I would, as Secretary of State, be advocating and lobbying the legislature to come back and take a look at our licensing laws, how they're created, how they're reviewed, and let's get some common sense in there so that we can put Georgians to work, that we are inviting people who are coming here on military transfer, they can go to work, that people who are wanting to start a business, that they can go to work, that we are not standing in the way of them being able to provide for themselves or for their families.
Excellent. So obviously the biggest and probably the one entity that people realize the Secretary of State covers is elections.
Yep.
So before we jump into the individual components of the election system, tell us about the SAFE Commission.
All right. So SAFE Commission was brought about just this past spring by the current Secretary of State, Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp has, the way that he explains it, the SAFE Commission is a response to voter activists who were not satisfied with the bills that had been put in front of the legislators this year. And one of the main criticisms is that there was no sunlight, that it was being done behind closed doors, that we really did not know what was going on. I did help lead the charge to defeating Senate Bill 403, and certainly one of my main criticisms was what this was being done in such a way that we could not tell if a preferred vendor was already even had been identified. There was no real way of understanding that.
What are the details of 403? Just
Senate Bill 403 was came out and essentially it was trying to solve the election voting machine problems, the voting machine procurement this year. And the main objections that we had to it is that the current Secretary of State would do the entire request for proposal and manage the entire transaction and basically sign the contract before the November election, and the next Secretary of State would have nothing to do but to implement it. And it just smacked of a hardwired deal. It just like, okay, there was not a whole lot of interest in replacing those voting machines until all of a sudden there was. And now it was like they were trying to get it through as fast as possible. And, you know, without having a whole lot of insight as to how the sausage was being made, we were like, okay, there just seems to be an unusual amount of effort trying to get this done. We got, I testified against it at the subcommittee meeting, Voter GA, Common Cause, many election and voter activist groups testified against it. We made enough noise that it made that the General Assembly did take notice, and it's died on the very last day, sine die, within hours. It died. And whether they ran out of time or somebody just canned it, we don't know. Okay, but it needed to be canned. Fast forward a few weeks later, Mr. Kemp went ahead and announced this commission, the SAFE commission, and this
SAFE is the secure, accessible, and fair elections.
Correct, and it's at first he announced a bipartisan commission, and we objected to that. I actually talked to Mr. Kemp on the phone about it. And this needs to be a multi-partisan commission, and he assured me that would have been a mistake in the AJC. It was always intended to be a multi-partisan position. And so John Mons is a Libertarian in South Georgia, and he is now a Libertarian that's on that commission. It's an 18-member commission. It has a lot of representation by election officials, county election officials. It does have voters at large, independent, and of course Republicans and Democrats. The meeting yesterday was at the Sewell Mill Library in East Cobb County, and it was very informative. There were 3 presentations. We learned a lot about Georgia elections. There's also a lot of criticism of this commission because, and we're going to find out if this commission is truly an active commission that's going to do some research and actually churn out some recommendations that are based on research, or we're going to find out that there is just kind of a blue ribbon kind of thing that's really not doing much anything. We don't know yet, but we are very looking at the schedule that they have, how much work that they're trying to get done, and more importantly, how much are they depending on vendors themselves for the information they have. So, in my opinion, I did congratulate current Secretary of State Kemp for calling the commission because that's what we asked for. But it's not finished. We want a real commission. We don't want a window dressing. That means they have work to do. And as of right now, I'm still waiting to see their agenda, and they should be extraordinarily busy this summer.
So what were they charged with originally? What was the commission charged with? Actual just looking at the entire election system, or looking specifically at replacing the voting machines?
It's specific to voting machines. Okay, and it is to make recommendations. It is to review the data that they have, as to take a look at the issues. It was to provide a vehicle for public input. So that the public can see what's happening, and to be able to have an open process for what are the criteria that we're going to use for deciding which next election machines, what are type of the technologies, where does the technology stop and start in terms of the security. You're going to hear a lot of controversy going on about the hand-marked ballots, and it's extraordinarily important conversation for Georgia voters to be in, because if you're anybody that's in computer systems, you know that you can make a variable stand for anything. But if you actually have someone write in English language, then you're not going to be able to change that inside a computer program. Let me explain that a little differently. The problem we're having, and the very big challenge is that, are the voters going to be able to hand mark a ballot so that that ballot is person readable, human readable, all right, and that anybody could pick up that ballot and see the intention of that voter without any other piece of machinery, without a scanner, without anything. And if that's the case, then you have a legitimate ballot, okay, and that ballot, somebody can see the intention of that voter that on election night or a year later or whatever.
Right.
But alternatively, if you have a touch screen system that prints that ballot out but the actual results, the actual things are embedded in a barcode, and the barcode is what gets tabulated. People can't read barcodes.
Right.
And that barcode, any programmer can tell you, I can make that barcode stand for anything.
Correct.
Okay, and I can make it stand for one thing 1 minute, and I can stand for another thing the next minute. So it does introduce a security flaw at the very beginning of the voting sequence, and of course the opposition to this is like, okay, look, we have election nights, we have thousands and thousands of ballots, we got to process all these things, and we need to have an automated way of doing it. We don't want pre-printed forms because pre-printed forms cost a lot of money. I might order 200,000 ballots and only 10,000 voters show up. You have all this other, other things. So it's a huge discussion that we have to have because the election integrity of the elections is paramount. With what's going on in the country right now, election integrity is by far one of the most important decisions that Georgia is going to make over the next 3 years. And we have to have a system in which a majority of Georgians are not suspicious of what's actually being done within that election system. And I am of the opinion that hand-marked ballots provides that ability, because between hand-marked ballots and whatever scanning system that you end up reading those marks, that's fine, but you can always do sampling audits later to see that everything is kosher.
Right.
All right, and being able to provide that kind of ironclad guarantee, your vote's being counted the way you intended it to be counted.
I just want Secretary of State DuVal to give me a receipt whenever I cast my ballot.
So
right now we all walk into the electronic machine and pop our little yellow card in, and we vote, and we press a button, and the little yellow card pops out, and the screen goes blank, and I walk out and wonder, did I make a mistake? I mean,
yes.
I'm pretty confident in my ability to check all the right boxes, but how about one more last check before I walk out?
Yes. So that's a great point, so you should be able to hold your ballot and be able to read your ballot. Okay. Now that's not a receipt. What ideally you would, you remember the bubbles, those
yes.
bubble sheets that you used to in high
Absolutely.
school? That would be a kind of an idea of how it might look. And then you would take that over to an optical reader, and then the optical reader would actually record the results. All right. And that would be the end of it. You can't actually walk out with a receipt because of vote buy-in and vote selling problems.
Right.
All right. But in terms of being able to review,
I would have no problem leaving my receipt there.
Right.
I just want to have the one last assurance for me personally. Okay, this is just me talking. I want to have the one last assurance, because once I leave that voting booth, I'm at the mercy of the equipment. And I'm fairly confident the equipment is, but I want to be really confident. I don't want to be fairly confident. And the other thing is, it's a paper trail that you can audit the machines with.
Yes.
Which then eliminates that, the Russians hacked our machines, because if I hear that one more time, I'm going to go crazy. But, we've heard that for the last 2 years. But something, and I know I'm not a unique voter. Okay. I know that this is something that voters are clamoring for, because it brings another level of integrity, but also brings a level of accountability where we can verify that the machines, like you said, you can do sampling.
Yeah.
You sample.
You can do sampling.
You can take a stack of ballots and I call them receipts. You have another word for them, but you know what I mean. I just use that word because that seems the most logical thing.
Yeah.
When I'm finished, I get a printout.
If you think about, and I don't want to bore the listeners with statistics, but if you think about the deviations and things like that, the closer you get to 50-50, the larger your sample is going to be. And then when you're right at 50-50, you're at a recount,
right,
which is 100% audit. So, it's a good way.
It's a really good way to make sure that there's integrity. And I don't think anyone can argue with it at that point. I don't think anyone can come back and say the machines just aren't everything we want them to be, when you have a double check. All right, we don't get off in the weeds there. So elections, I want to emphasize too that all the things you did with SB, it was a 408?
403.
403, SB 403, that was as a private citizen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, that's another important thing to remember for all the voters out there. You did this on your own time because you were passionate about it.
Yes, that is correct.
And this has led into your campaign.
Well, I was, by the time that the legislative session started, I had declared my candidacy, but my candidacy came out of voting, the voting machine problems. I went to a Common Cause presentation in December. I was coming from, I was a former IT director, had to manage IT security vendors and make sure I was the HIPAA officer. And so I had a lot to do with security, and I was appalled. When I heard the state of our voting machines, that our voting machines were on Windows 2000 systems that had not been patched in years and years and years, that there were central points of failure, that there's even the premises that they were they were stored in were not even locked. Like, okay, whoever's doing the security here, they're not in a security frame of mind.
Right.
And that was the tipping point. Okay, this is it. I can't sit on the sidelines any longer. I'm getting into this election. And it was also the opportunity to talk about election reform and being able to talk about election reform, not just through the primary. You'd ask why I don't run as Democrat or Republican. I know I'd get primaried if I were trying to talk about election reform. You know,
now you get to talk till November.
I get to talk about it to November, and I want the listeners to know that I'm going to be talking about it past November, that we are going to be working to establish coalitions in this state, establish effective lobbying in this state to bring election reform, things that would benefit not only Libertarian Party members, but benefit all Georgia. And I would like for the Libertarian Party to say, hey, yeah, we are advocating for things that benefit all Georgians.
Well, I'd like for the Democrats and the Republicans out there, the independent mind Democrats and Republicans, to listen to what you just said as well. The fact that, it doesn't really matter which party you root for. I think we all want to have elections and an election system that we are 100% confident that the results are the results.
Mm-hmm.
I think that goes way beyond party politics, and the Libertarians are going to be the ones who lead this.
Yes. Yep.
All right, so elections, voting machines, ballot access, gerrymandering, ranked choice voting, all these things, they're all encompassing inside election, the election purview. So we talked a little bit about voting machines. Let's talk about the current ballot access laws in Georgia and what the major parties have done to restrict, exclude independents.
The ballot access laws in Georgia are some of the worst in the entire nation. And a lot of Georgians wonder, like, why do you Libertarians always running for governor, or why are you running for Secretary of State, but you will not run for my local state house, or you won't run for local? And the answer to that is that we can't, not without a lot of trouble. Ballot access restrictions were introduced in the late 40s as a response to the communist scare in Georgia, and they were never repealed. I'll give you a very good example of how that plays out. We have Martin Cowan running over in the 13th district. Martin is very qualified to be a congressman. He's a former judge. He knows what he's doing.
That's the U.S. district.
U.S.
right?
district. Yeah, U.S. House district.
So he's going to represent 600,000 plus people, because that's an important number. So go ahead.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is that he can't campaign right now on getting his message out. He can't spend his money on flyers. He can't do all that stuff because he is saddled with collecting 20,188 signatures. The Democrat and the Republican that are in that race don't have to do that. All they do is go down to the Secretary of State's office and put in a filing fee. That's it. That's all they have to do. And then they're off doing their campaign. The reason this is so insidious is that you can't grow a party if you can't run a local race. I would have much preferred starting at a local race. I would have run for a state house race. It would be a lot easier for me as a first-time candidate to run as a state house race. I mean, local races are training grounds. Local races are where you learn to be a candidate. It's where your staff learns how to run a campaign. And the Democrats and Republicans know this, and that's why they restrict it. They say, okay, no, we'll let you run statewide races because it'll exhaust all your resources and you won't know how to do it anyway. All right?
Right.
But we'll let you do that, but you can't run. And it very effectively inhibits. I mean, it's really, really hard to create a party, an active, competitive party, if you can't compete locally. And that's why those ballot access restrictions are there.
Is this an accurate figure? 8 out of 10 Georgia House races have no competition.
Yes. That was the last figure was 2016. I don't know. It's
right.
actually available now, but I don't know what it is right
now, and I know that's.
But 8 out of 10 Georgia House
so there's
races.
180 House seats.
Mm-hmm.
So what, 30, 40 maybe were actually had competition.
That was it. And that was it. And the fact that they had no competition and yet they're still requiring libertarians or independents or Greens or anybody else that wants to run to have an incredible amount of signatures just to run. That is political oppression. That is a very definition of political oppression.
And I think, it's easy for people to hear that, but then I don't think they realize the actual, okay, so great. Nobody else wanted to run in that district, whatever, no big deal. It's not that no one else wanted to run. It's that the burden, if you don't want to be a Democrat or a Republican, is so great that you can't run.
Right.
But then what does that do to that local community? Talk about what restricting choice does to that local community.
That the local community does not have any kind of civic or things to participate in. The impact, think about this. If you have somebody that's unopposed on the ballot, Georgia State House, they're unopposed. There's no newspaper covering the story. There's no debates covering the story. There's no reason to get out and talk about the issues. There's not the social aspects.
There's no barbecue.
There's no
parades.
Right.
There's nothing. The community just says, well, we got our guy.
That's it. The primary is done. Everybody go home, And the impact, generation after generation of having this problem in which the people are, they're unopposed. We now have entire generations of young people who don't even know that we have local elections, much less have never seen one or participated in one. All right. A lot of people think of ballot access laws, too, as it's just a restriction on the candidate. And I always remind them that it's just not the candidate. It's anybody and everybody who is not satisfied with the choices that they have on the ballot. As Americans, you should have the right to coalesce and organize around somebody in your community that you think would represent your community and not experience oppression from the government that you cannot organize around that particular person. And that is an extraordinarily oppression of all the members of that community that wish that they could actually have another representation, but they can't. They cannot engage or participate in the political process. You can't get on the ballot. You can't participate in the political process in a meaningful way as a running candidate.
Well, and I think another important byproduct of that is you get extremes, because you don't have another voice in that community that would be a moderating factor. So if you look around, and this isn't just unique to Georgia, but since we live here, but if you look around the country, you see some areas, and let's be honest, both parties do it all around the country. We have libertarians specifically have ballot access problems nearly everywhere.
Yep.
And you end up with extreme positions on either side because there's no moderating voice there to come and say, hey, did anybody ever think about this, doing it this way? So you lose that ability.
Yep. So
hand in hand with ballot access, of course, goes gerrymandering.
Yep.
And talk about gerrymandering has been worn, and I've been around Georgia politics a long time. It's worn like a badge of honor here in Georgia, of how each side can do the other side by, we'll if we don't like this particular guy, we'll just redraw his district and district him out, because we've seen that happen. We've actually had candidates have to move to another area so they can be closer and requalify. And this is both parties.
Yep.
Democrats did it for decades, and Republicans are doing it now. So talk about how ballot access and gerrymandering go hand in hand.
Sure. All right. So as you said, gerrymandering is the party in power drawing the political lines to their advantage so that they maximize their representation in the legislature and minimize the other. Another way of saying gerrymandering is the art of wasting your opponent's votes. However you want to say it, what it is that if you actually take a look at the let's just say for Pennsylvania, because I know it off the top of my head, Pennsylvania is almost right down the middle, 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. They have 16 members of the United States House. All right, if that Pennsylvania was represented correctly, okay, appropriately, they'd have 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans for a total of 16.
Right.
But because of gerrymandering, they have 13 Republicans and 3 Democrats. All right. And that's what gerrymandering does. Even though the population of Pennsylvania is 50-50 split right down the middle between the two parties, what ends up in Congress is 13 out of 16 on the Republican side. And that's how effective 21st century gerrymandering is. And that's the Republicans doing it in that case, Democrats doing it in Maryland. Whoever's in the party in power does it at the time. The way it fits in with ballot access is that you end up drawing these districts in which you're packing your opponents all into one district so that you waste as many votes as possible. You only need 50% plus 1 to win an election. So anything after that, you're just wasting of your opponent. I think John Lewis, his district down there might be 70% Democrat. That 20% past 50 is completely wasted. Those votes could have been distributed out to other counties to make that a competitive seat and make the other counties or other districts a competitive seat. It's insidious. The worst part about this is the 21st century gerrymandering is taking the processing power, computing power, all the information that you're leaving behind on Facebook and Google and all these, and they're able to correlate that to which in Georgia is which primary you participated in.
Right.
And they have a great statistic that's turning out to be extraordinarily reliable, and that is if you pick out the same primary for 2 elections in a row, then you're going to probably vote for president and that same ticket. And we're very reliable. Yes. And if they don't have that, they can say, okay, well, if you're ordering Guns and Ammo magazine and this one's ordering Atlantic magazine, we can pretty much guess, which, that's where the big data comes in.
Right.
It's huge. The Supreme Court heard 3 cases on gerrymandering this term. Not 1, not 2, but 3. And that's how big it is. And that decision might come out before this podcast is released. It's just it's any day now. And it's going to be a game changer no matter what. In terms of the ballot access, it's just another way of limiting. It's another way of limiting your choices.
And I think people may or may not realize that there's a level of collusion here between Democrats and Republicans.
Yes.
I mean, they really enjoy the fact that they control the electoral process. So they will in fact give each other safe seats in exchange for the other side not barking too loud,
right,
and not filing lawsuits. So you really have, I think the last, and you may have better statistics than I do, but in the House of Representatives, in Congress, there are 435 seats. The last I heard, there were 50-ish or so seats that are actually competitive.
It's actually way less.
You have, So I mean, they've done it to the point where it's an illusion at this point.
It's political theater.
It's an illusion. Yeah. Really, I think if you look right now in Georgia with the contested and uncontested races, you're going to pretty much see who your House and Senate are right now. You can do it today. You can just look at the primaries and see. Even in this banner year in which there's more new candidates than ever, you still have, I'm totally positive that 60% unopposed. And that's down from, so. That's amazing. Okay, you mentioned Georgia is a 50 plus 1 state. Okay, so explain what that means.
So in Georgia, you have to have a majority to win office. All right, and this is that is that you have to have 50% plus one to actually win win office in the state. This is a good thing. There are other states in which you just have to get the most votes, and that's a bad thing. And the reason in getting the most votes is a bad thing. I mean, it works okay when you only have 2 candidates, but if you have
10,
but when you have when you have 10, then you're basically somebody's going to win because the opposition is fractured.
Right.
And the challenge with that is minority rule. I mean, basically, you know, somebody won with 37% of the vote, but 63% of the people voted against them. Right. And so Georgia has the runoff system, and I would not get rid of it forever, never. That and people are going to be tempted to that, because I am going to be coming out and saying runoffs are expensive. We spend millions of dollars in the state of Georgia on runoffs. Okay, but we don't have to. This is where we would introduce ranked choice voting.
And I want you to talk about ranked choice voting and tell us what that is, what it's all about, how it works, but more importantly, how it's a reform and how it'll save money.
Well, the ranked choice voting has a great feature in which it has what's called an instant runoff, and that is that your voter will go to the poll one time, give all the information at one time, and not have to come back 9 weeks later, and they were able to do it. So how does that work? Ranked choice voting is nothing more than putting a 1 next to your favorite candidate and a 2 next to your second favorite candidate, and so on and so forth. You just rank the candidates in the order of preference. And then when it comes to time to count those, they start looking at all the ones that were ranked number 1, and if anybody is at 50% plus 1, the election's over. But if they don't have 50%, then the candidate that had the lowest amount of votes, they're going to be eliminated, and the second round starts. And those voters that chose that candidate, their second choice is going to get applied. So the vote is never wasted. And that's the important thing for voters, is that the vote is never, ever wasted. You can choose the candidate that you truly want without worrying if it's going to impact a candidate that you detest. There's no more lesser of two evils problem. There's no more strategic voting. There's no more listening to somebody try to guilt trip you, saying, okay, if you vote for this candidate, you're going to... If you
vote for the Libertarian, you're going to elect the Democrat or the Republican.
Right. That's gone. That is gone. And because of that, ballot access is no longer incented. There's no incentive to have ballot access restrictions if the spoiler effect is eliminated. And that is why ranked choice voting is going to be probably one of my signature issues this year. One is because Maine just passed it. All right. The people of Maine have fought like hell against a tyrannical governor, a tyrannical legislature, and they've passed it twice, and this time it's going to stick. All right. It's being passed in cities across the United States. It would benefit Georgia military overseas, because they would be able to participate in not only our elections, but in our runoffs. We wouldn't have this 9-week period between the time a general election takes place and the runoff takes place. It would save Georgia millions of dollars. All right. And the thing is because it is not biased against third parties, because it actually encourages third parties and independents, I anticipate that both the Democrats and the Republicans in this state are going to be against it. And they're not going to be against it because of anything other than it's going to be different. It's going to be too complicated.
Too complicated, right? Right. It's way too complicated. So basically, libertarians understand that Georgia voters are smart enough to be able to go to the ballot and rank who they want as their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many are on there. But the Democrats and the Republicans are going to tell Georgia voters that it's just too complex and it really won't work.
That's exactly what they're going to do. And the reason is it protects the two-party system.
Right.
They work together in a bipartisan fashion to protect the two-party system. You think they're always at each other's throats? No, they are very bipartisan when it comes to protecting that two-party system. That is why ballot access and rules have not been changed since 1943. They work it together. No matter who's in power, they always kind of throw something out there, but they just never get around to it.
Right.
They protect it. So that's going to be the huge. It's going to be a fun argument to say, hey, it serves the military. Are you against serving the military with using ranked choice voting? It's going to be fun talking to them, and we're going to save millions. I'm actually trying to get to how many millions. It's not a statewide number. You have to actually get it from all 159 counties, and it's not a line item. So we're going to be working hard to see if we can find out how many millions. But we got a preview that Fulton County spent about $7 million recently just on elections, and a good portion of it is going to be in runoff.
Wow. So you actually, as a test, you did this for the Republican primary.
Yes.
Talk about that.
So I, for the Republican governor's primary, put all 4 of the candidates out there on a poll, and it advertised on Facebook. So you had Casey Cagle, Brian Kemp, Hunter Hill, Clay Tippins, and Michael
Williamson.
Michael Williams.
Right.
And invited the public to come in and rank their choices from their favorite to their least favorite. And it was fascinating. First, they got to experience ranked choice voting firsthand in a current race. But the most fascinating part about it is that neither Casey Cagle or Brian Kemp really came out on top as a consensus candidate. They had a lead at one point, but Hunter Hill was the consensus candidate for all of the Republicans out there.
So basically, Hunter Hill was the most broadly liked candidate among the Republicans, which then would tell you that he got a lot of 1s, 2s, and 3s most likely.
Right.
I mean, and look, that's who you want. You want the guy because that's the guy who the consensus is among the group.
Well, think about how much stronger the Republican ticket would be, or for that matter, our politics would be, because let's see, Cagle got 40% of the vote.
Right.
60% of the GOP voted against him.
For somebody else, correct?
Right. All right. Kemp got 25% of the vote. Therefore, 75% of the GOP voted against him. So now you have this runoff between two people who, two candidates who were both have a majority of the GOP voters in Georgia against them. It doesn't make any sense if you think about it, especially if you know of a better way to actually have consensus. If you had a consensus candidate heading into the November election, it's going to impact your ability to get voters out to the polls. It's going to impact your ability to raise money. It's going to impact your ability to do things. You have polarizing candidates. That's a result of gerrymandering. It's a result of years and years of just neglect. But it's the polarizing candidates that are actually making it past the primaries. It's not the consensus builders like a Hunter Hill.
Excellent. So let's wrap this up with, we started out why Libertarian. Let's wrap it up with what changes, what benefits would you see having a Libertarian as the Secretary of State for Georgians?
The Libertarian, the thing that I offer more than anything else is, first thing, I am a citizen candidate. I do not answer to any leadership. I do not answer to any lobbyists. My opponents are probably men of integrity. They're probably, they're very qualified. And yet they are burdened with maintaining the two-party system. They are burdened with answering to other folks in this race. When it comes to elections, you want somebody who is not biased, who doesn't have a predetermined dog in this fight. You want somebody who can officiate, to referee, to say, hey, these are the rules. We're going to have a fair election. We're going to have integrity in these elections. And no, I'm not going to be playing games with voter rolls. No, I'm not going to be playing games with closing precincts down. No, I'm not going to be playing games and trying to suppress the vote because it's going to impact one party or another. I'm not going to be playing games with lawsuits, saying, okay, we're going to go light on this lawsuit because it would benefit our side, or we're going to, really push this lawsuit because it, whatever. No, we're not doing that. We're going to do what's best for all Georgians. As a Libertarian candidate, as a citizen candidate, the one thing that I offer to Georgia is integrity in the system. That is why I'm running.
Excellent. And I know you mentioned voter rolls. That seems to have come to the forefront now with what happened in Ohio. Georgia has I think it's a 3-year. That's
correct.
Yeah. Every 3 years, we purge the voter rolls.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's, this is a very fascinating issue. I was a little surprised the Supreme Court went along with this case because so basically the case was about if somebody does not vote, in 2 elections in a row, they can get purged. All right, and in the state, and that's a 2-year, and in Georgia, it is 3-year. If you're not active in voting or participating in elections, you can get purged. And honestly, they got to do it. Okay, the Secretary of State is going to get sued no matter what. They're going to get sued if they're not purging the rolls. Okay, because you got to have accurate rolls, but they're going to get sued if they're too aggressive with it at the same time. So you got to find that particular balance in there. The one thing that I am going to do and advocate for as Secretary of State is what's called same-day voter registration. Same-day voter registration just means that, if you go up and you're ready to vote at a polling and you find out that you're no longer on the polls anymore because you've been serving overseas or because you've been doing kind of things, you just go over to a table and you do all the things that you would need to do to register to vote. My opponents will tell you, well, that's not enough time to process it. Well, I cry foul on that. That's not a legit answer. We can approve credit. We can figure out, if the government can't figure out where you live with all the information we have now on the spot, it's just an excuse.
And Georgia already has a provisional ballot procedure in place anyway.
Right.
So, you treat that, like you said, you treat same-day voting like a provisional ballot. It won't take any time to check that.
It won't take any time at all.
And
it protects voters from partisan monkeying with the voter rolls. Right. And that's we got to make sure that that is protected.
Talk to the voters. Tell the voters what you want. Wrap it up with whatever you want to say to the voters.
All right. Well, again, my name is Smythe DuVal. Smythe DuVal. I am running for the Georgia Secretary of State. I am a citizen candidate for the Georgia Secretary of State. I'm not a polished politician. I have not been public speaking all my life. I am learning how to do this on the fly. I decided to get into this race because I could not sit on the sidelines any longer. I've been an activist for years, and this was my year to do something about it. Not only am I doing something this election year, but I'm going to be following up with creating coalitions among libertarians and independents and anybody within the Democrat and Republican Party that wants to join us in election reform. Then we're welcome. I would encourage all libertarians out there that you insist that they join us. We're not going to be a swing vote in 2018. We're not going to be a swing vote in 2020. The price that we want for our vote, for our support, is election reform. We want ranked choice voting. We want gerrymandering abolished. We want particular things. We want representation for all Georgians. I'm bringing that message to the state of Georgia. I've been inspired by the people of Maine. The people of Maine fought an incredibly hard to get where they are today. I was inspired by that, and I want to bring that baton to the state of Georgia. And in Georgia, we bring election reform to the forefront, that we establish a coalition, and that we actually bring these things to pass.
Tell people where they can find more information about your campaign, where they can send money.
All right. My Facebook page is fb.com, DuVal for Georgia, DuVal FORGA. Or you can just type my name on Facebook, Smythe DuVal, SMYTHE, DuVal, and you'll find it on Facebook. I do have a website that we're finally going to revamp here soon, but it's DuValForGeorgia.net, DuVal for FORGeorgia.net. And both the Facebook page and the website does have a link for donations. I would implore you to go ahead and send in donations. Campaigns cost money. I need to get the message out. I'm looking for people to donate. I'm looking for people that are willing to host a party to help me fundraise, host a party at your home, or host a party at one of your favorite local restaurants. Let me have the opportunity to speak to your friends, to your neighbors. But more than anything, I don't have $1 million like opponents have to get my name on yard signs all over the place. So I got to be more clever. I have to be more connected. And if you're listening to this podcast, I implore you to give us a call, help us get the message of election reform, the message that there is an alternative to the Democrats and Republicans.
Excellent. Smythe, thank you so much. If you want any information about any candidate, any Libertarian candidate running this year, it's LPGeorgia, spell the word Georgia out.com/about/candidates. That will get you all of the Georgia candidates that are running for Libertarian Party this year. I'd like to thank Smythe for being here. Good luck. And as always, our producer extraordinaire, Matt Franklin of Most Uniquest. Until next time.
You've been listening to the official podcast of the Libertarian Party of Georgia. The theme song for this episode was Metaltania by Kevin MacLeod, released to the public domain through freepd.com. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate us and leave a review. You can email the show's producers at podcast@lpgeorgia.com. If you're a Libertarian in the state of Georgia, don't forget to find your local affiliate at lpgeorgia.com.